So you've read all 3 books in the Remembrance Earth trilogy that starts with the 3-body problem. You have binged through the Netflix TV show, and you're trying to figure out what to read next. I am here to answer that question, to give you recommendations on where to go from here, because quite honestly, I'm in the same boat now. So if that all sounds good, let's stick around and get started. So I'm going to break this video up into 2 parts. First, it's going to be other books written by the same author, or kind of by the same author if you know what's coming. And then I'm also going to talk about books written by other authors that have similar feels, tones, plots, etc. that might be other good jumping off points. So first, let's talk about if you want to stick with this author. And so if you finish the trilogy, you might have looked on Goodreads and noticed that even though it's technically listed as a trilogy, there's actually a 4th book listed in the series sequence, and that is The Redemption of Time. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that it actually has a different author name, and that is because it's not written by Cixin Liu, if I'm saying his name somewhat right in this video, but instead written by another author who loved the original trilogy and actually decided to write fan fiction. This fan fiction got incredibly popular in China where it was written, and they got the opportunity to have their book traditionally published and endorsed by the original author and publisher and be deemed to be part of the universe. And so I did go ahead and read it because that seemed to be the natural thing to do afterwards. And I will be honest, maybe it's because I knew going into the book the history of how the book was curated and brought into publication, but it sure felt like fan fiction. The beginning honestly wasn't too bad. It sets you in the same world after the events of Death End. I'm not going to spoil anything here, just in case you're watching if you haven't finished the original trilogy. If you haven't, just go do that. But essentially, it follows the events afterwards. It follows different characters and kind of explores different plots of what could be afterwards. And I have a few issues with this. So first is the fact that I am somewhat of a purist when it comes to published works. I do believe that an author has the right to finish a book in a series wherever they see fit, and that they get to decide if there are unanswered questions. Now, certainly fan fiction has its place, and I think it's great for letting people explore what could happen, the possibilities, the what ifs, and allowing people to spend more time with the characters in that world, etc. So I think that fan fiction is great, but I am a little bit bothered even going into this book, the fact that they actually had this endorsed and labeled as a true proper book within the universe, because it is not the original author's intent to write this story, but instead it was kind of patched on and hacked on to the end of the series as something that felt incredibly unnecessary. And so that's my biggest feedback, is that when reading this book, definitely it felt like the kind of story that had some interesting moments at the beginning that turned eye-rolling as the story went on, because it definitely felt ridiculous, over the top. Again, maybe I was going in with some strong bias, but the story went in places I did not love, and it definitely felt like it was over the top and not being true to the spirit of the original work. And it just explored ideas and characters that I didn't need the answer to. I wasn't done with Death's End thinking, I just need to know what happened to this one character. I need to know what happens next. It's a kind of story that has an ending, and while I would possibly change up small things about the ending if I were to pick at the plot of Death End, in and of itself, it is the proper ending the author wanted. And so anything else just feels like, again, happenstance or what if, and it just doesn't feel necessary, and it doesn't feel like a respect to the original work. So if you can't tell, I don't actually recommend picking up The Redemption of Time next. I only finished it for the sake of this video because I knew that people would want an opinion if they should go ahead and read that. And having taken the time to read this painful work, I will say no, I did not enjoy it. I gave it 2 stars. Would not recommend it. I think if you're looking to read more by this author, there are other places to go, which we'll talk about next. So if you want to read something that is properly written by the same author, my personal recommendation actually surprises even myself, and that is to go check out their short story collections. I am someone who has strayed away from short fiction over the last few years. I just find that as a format, it doesn't always appeal to me, especially when it comes to science fiction. I like big ideas, which is something I love so much about this trilogy. And I don't usually find those epic ideas in the small package of short fiction. However, the Wandering Earth short story collection really surprised me. Now, one thing to note is that most of the stories would read more like the length of a novella, and I think it more follows that format. So it doesn't necessarily lean into the traditional storytelling trope or style of a short story. I remember learning that in English class about the certain curve of the story climax in a short story. And so these ones really feel like mini novels where you have often a prologue, a couple chapters, an epilogue, etc. And the first story in the collection is how it gets its name, The Wandering Earth, which is such a creative idea, where the idea that our planet is in danger and we are going to die out if we stay on Earth. However, rather than leaving Earth, which is the traditional thing that is done in these science fiction stories, the idea is that we take the planet with us and we find a way to move the planet safely away to another solar system. And I think that the idea and concept behind it is so brilliant and original. For me, this short story really captured the same aha feeling I had reading the original trilogy, where it had some really big ideas centering around humanity in danger and what would we do, how would we try to get out of it. It focuses on individuals, but again, it's a little bit more about the big ideas surrounding them. And I really feel that if you love the original trilogy, this first short story is so worth your time. Within the collection, as always, there are some stories that are stronger than others, but honestly, this is one of the strongest collections of short stories I've read in a very long time. I love this collection, as in a new favorite of the year. And there were other stories in there like Curse 5.0, which has some meta elements, which I personally loved. There was a really cool story dealing with a micro universe, which again kind of ties into a lot of the ideas you see explored within the original trilogy. And that's what I love, is you really get to see where some of the ideas for the longer work sparked from, if some of these stories were necessarily possibly written earlier than that, and getting to see the germinations of those thoughts and getting to play around with different what ifs. So similar concepts, but going in different directions, and then again got fleshed out in the longer trilogy. So I adored this short story collection. And again, I went in with low expectations. I didn't think I would love it this much. And I cannot stop thinking about these short stories, which again is something I often think is that short stories in my mind tend to be not that memorable, but this collection completely proved me wrong. Then from there, I went on to read Hold Up the Sky, which is another short story collection, and I think I made the mistake of reading these back to back as I was preparing for this video. This short story collection is solid, but in my mind it pales a little bit in comparison to his first short story collection that was translated, and so I like this one, but I kept comparing it and finding this one to be the lesser one. So if you're someone who's already, maybe a year ago or something, you've already read The Wandering Earth and are looking for more short stories, I would recommend this one. But if you're trying to decide and you're only going to read one of the two collections, I personally recommend reading his first collection. It's just a little bit stronger, but this one still had some gems. I personally really liked the story that involved contraction, just some really cool ideas around what might or if happen. Maybe if you've already read The Wandering Earth, say a year ago, and are looking to read his other collection, I do still recommend it as long as you have some space between the two. But if you're only planning on reading one of his collections at this point in time, I would recommend his first. It's just a little bit stronger again. And that being said, I still think that there are some gems in his newer collection. For instance, Contractions was one I thought was really smart and cool. It had some crazy ideas involving the idea of the universe expanding and then of course what would happen when it contracts again. So I really enjoyed kind of the ideas played around with in that collection there. So definitely check it out if you're looking for more. Now let's talk about some novels by the same author, and I want to talk about Ball Lightning, which is another book I just read in preparation for this video, so I have not reviewed it yet, and I absolutely loved it. This author is easily becoming a favorite of mine. So this story follows a young man who as a boy saw this horrific event where his parents were killed from a ball of lightning, and so he ends up spending his life, devoting his life to studying this phenomenon. And of course, as you would expect with a science fiction novel, it turns out that there is more going on. There are larger stakes, more epic things in the works, and the story gets larger as the story goes, as this young man turns into an adult. And this is one I love for so many reasons. First off, the beginning is very emotional, very tragic, and definitely has that coming of age feel, something that I love in my fiction, something I normally see more in my horror content, but I love when it trickles over into my science fiction content. And the story, as I mentioned, just has this a feeling of wonder. There was something so enjoyable reading it. I want to describe it as the experience of reading an anime movie, or feeling like you're having that experience when you read something in the vein of Your Name or these time twisty stories. And I just had that same feeling of excitement in there. Not necessarily that it deals with time travel, but just the fact that it deals with the wonder, the speculative, the unknown, and it just felt so cinematic reading it. I've said before, I am someone who actually struggles with visualizing what I'm reading, which might seem funny for someone who reads so much, but this is one that I just could picture. I felt like it needs to be a movie. If it's not already, it needs to be translated here. And I would love to see it on screen because it was so fascinating. I want to reread it. I love it. early favorite of the year. Highly recommend that one. Definitely worth your time. And I think it has a similar feel to the Remembrance Earth trilogy. So again, if you're looking for something with a similar tone but a different plot, I think it is both similar enough to appeal to you, but also different enough that it didn't feel like I was rehashing the same story all over again, if that makes sense. Next, I want to talk about Supernova Era. And this is another novel by the same author, and I'm nervous to talk about it because I suspect I'm going to lose all of your respect for me as a reviewer, because I actually enjoyed this book. It has very mixed negative reviews, and I am the exception. I like it. So I'm going to pitch it to you and help you to figure out if it's what you should read next if you're trying to read more by the same author. So this is a book set in a future where there is this event that will cause this radiation to hit the earth, and it's going to kill off everyone who is, I believe, over the age of 13. And so this event is coming, and as with his other books, it's the idea that you know the event is coming, and so much of his books often deal with the preparation for that. And so we have the adults knowing that their death is not able to be avoided. It's going to happen, but in the time they have left, they want to train and prepare their children to run the world without them. So you follow them the first part of the book as they are going through those preparations. They're trying to find the smartest children to be in charge of everything. And then the later half of the book follows them after all the adults are dead and follows what happens in the world when you have a bunch of psychotic kids running the world. And I love this book because I'm a fan of messed up kids. I've said it before that especially when you look at young children, they're kind of little sociopaths. They don't often have good senses of empathy. You kind of teach that to them throughout society and through school and all of that. And so left with their own devices, with no consequences, with full control of the world, this book plays out a very humorously dark version of a future that feels completely ridiculous. So in terms of suspension of disbelief, you need to just buy into the idea, or you shouldn't even bother reading the story, because the setup makes you want to roll your eyes. But once you get past that, I had a great time reading it. It is a train wreck of a future, and I had so much fun reading it. It's very dark and vulgar, and just kind of know that it's going to portray a very ugly future. So I understand why people don't like it. And again, if you're hearing me describe it and think that is the stupidest idea for a book ever, please feel free to skip over this and just go to the next recommendation here. I like it, but I know that's a really unpopular opinion. All right, now I want to switch gears and talk about some books by other authors that I think I would recommend if you enjoyed the trilogy, but again, are looking for something different and not just reading through the author's backlist. Now, I want to preface this section by mentioning that I'm trying to give really good comparisons. However, by doing so, I am going to be talking about some books that I personally love and have talked about many times on my channel. I do see the comments that people feel I can be repetitive by talking about my favorites too often. I apologize for that, but if you're just watching this video looking for my best shots of if you like this trilogy, you should read this next, these are honestly the ones I recommend. Even though I talk about them a lot, if you haven't taken my advice, maybe it's time to do so. So the first book I want to talk about is an all-time favorite of mine, and that is Blindsight by Peter Watts. And so this is a speculative horror science fiction novel that follows a crew that go out to investigate. There is some possible sign of intelligent life out there, and so they're tasked to go and try to make that contact happen. And so within the story, as I mentioned, there are these horror elements to it, which, while you could argue that the trilogy of the Remembrance Earth is definitely science fiction first, it definitely deals with some horrific futures. And so this one leans more heavily into the horror side because it does involve a vampire, but it delves very hard into the believability of the science. And what I think will appeal to people is if you love the info dumps, and I mean that in a very kind way, the info dumps you will see in the Remembrance Earth trilogy, where the author will stop and explain common concepts, like explaining what the dark forest means and all of that. If you absolutely love those parts, if those are your aha moments reading that series, I would highly recommend this one, because the author does the same thing but with different concepts. So understanding different ideas around, I believe it's the Chinese wall and things like that, and philosophy terms. I learned so much by reading this book, and in the back of it, the author dives even further into the science and philosophy behind his writing. So I love that while this one is first and foremost a fiction story, it is just steeped in real science that just permeates every page, and there's just some really cool, heady ideas if you're looking for cerebral fiction where the characters are going to, at times, sit around and talk about some really cool concepts that are going to blow your mind. I cannot recommend this book enough. This really is the book that made me fall in love with hard science fiction. And again, I think if you love the trilogy, you will love this one possibly even more. Dare I say that? Next, let's talk about Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson. This is a standalone science fiction story told over 3 parts. Right at the beginning of the story, there is an event that causes the moon to explode. And because of that, there are fragments that are falling to the earth. And they are not necessarily causing the immediate destruction of the earth, but they realize that because of what it's doing to our atmosphere and the environment of earth, soon the world will become uninhabitable. So what we have is the earth preparing for the end of the world. And so we follow them as they prepare for a small crew to go and try to continue humanity on another planet. And so again, this is a book I would recommend to those of you that love the idea or concept of a plot where you have humanity preparing for this tragic event that is possibly coming and trying to figure out how they will survive and making those plans and then seeing it come to fruition. So within the story, we follow the characters, and it does jump through time. So again, it is more of a generational story, just like we have with the Remembrance Earth trilogy, where we follow characters and then things move forward in time. And so you have a similar idea here. Once again, this is one where there are definitely characters at the focus of the story, but for me, it's so much more about the science, the what ifs, how would we deal with this future coming to be, and following that along to its natural state. This one leans into something a little bit more anthropological at the end of it. So I'm not entirely sure if the ending is going to be a solid hit for those that love the Remembrance Earth trilogy, because it has a very, very different end than Death's End. But if you're intrigued, if you again love that plot setup, I do recommend this one. I again personally love it, so hopefully you will too. And I also want to talk about Vagabonds. This is a large science fiction novel that is translated from Chinese, where it is written. And this one is set in a future where we have expanded to have colonies on Mars. However, the colonies there have had a war of independence. They have completely broken off, and for a long period of time there was a silence between these two factions. However, they are trying to repair things, and so within the story we follow a group of Martian children that are sent off to Earth to be delegates, and they're trying to make peace and have that conversation, that back and forth, having that start again. And so we follow them particularly when they're actually returning home. And the interesting thing is we see them torn between the two cultures. The reason I want to recommend this book is specifically because a lot of people noted really enjoying reading these science fiction books from the perspective of a Chinese author. So I want to recommend this, which in terms of plot and setup is very different. This one is quite character focused. What I think this book does incredibly well is contrasting the differences between Western and Eastern culture, which is mirrored between Mars and Earth. On Mars, of course, everyone had to work together. There is a lot of pressure and just the idea that everyone has to really pitch in. Life is hard, but we do it because we're doing it together. Whereas those that stayed on Earth, there is still an idea of capitalism and more of a kind of North American worldview that has stayed more prevalent there. And so you get to see these cultural ideas clash within the story. And so I think if you love the Chinese aspects of the story of the Remembrance Earth in terms of getting that Chinese perspective, something that will hopefully change your mind or open your eyes and see things in a more complex way. I think especially myself included, I've gotten feedback on videos as well that I will often make shortcuts when I talk about different cultures, and I never mean to do that. So I really like this book in the complexities it deals with that. And again, it's written in the future, it brings in those science fiction elements, but it's very much a story that deals with culture differences and deals with them very head on. So I do recommend this one. I really liked it, and hopefully this one is a little bit more underhyped than some of the other books I'm talking about on this list. Next up, let's talk about Shards of Earth by Adrian Tchaikovsky, another book I talk about way too often but fits this video way too well, I'm going to argue. This is the first book in a completed trilogy where it's set in a future where there are these aliens that are known as the architects because they have come to Earth and basically reformed the planet. By doing so, they have destroyed it, and then we follow humanity as they are on the run. So this one, once again, has a similar plot where there are other forces at bay, possibly aliens involved, that are causing humanity to fight for our survival, to make plans and try to figure out how to survive. The focus, the narrative timeline, things like that are quite different than in Remembrance Earth, but I definitely see threads. And once again, this is one where I love the story in terms of the crazy concepts around it. I don't think that Adrian Tchaikovsky writes the strongest characters in this one, but I also say the same thing, that I don't read the Remembrance Earth trilogy for the really well-developed well-developed, fleshed out characters. I read for the really cool ideas, and I think if you're looking for that, once again, I do think that you'll be really happy with this trilogy. So finally, I want to go in a different direction and recommend some nonfiction, and that is The Future of Humanity. And what my thinking is here is when I read the original trilogy, I really enjoyed it, but one thing I noted in my dedicated review video, which I'll have linked down below and in the cards if I remember, but essentially I remember being really interested and enjoying the author talking about all these different science concepts, and I remember hearing other readers talk about how those concepts blew their mind. They were just jaw-dropped learning about, again, the dark forest and things like that, and I had already heard those same ideas told in other ways through different books. And so my recommendation, if you were someone who perhaps doesn't actually read a lot of science fiction, or specifically doesn't read a lot of nonfiction, is to try this book, The Future of Humanity, or there's plenty of other ones out here, but this is my pick. Basically, there are these great physicists and other scientists who write books for lay people like myself, where they go through and explain different concepts about quantum theory, the future of the universe, and all of those different ideas, and put them in ways that are very palatable for someone, again, like me, who doesn't always understand the deep physics behind something. And so I really recommend that if you just loved learning the science in the Three-Body Problem book and then its sequels, to go on and read more of the nonfiction itself. There are some really good ones out there. This author is a personal favorite of mine because in my mind, his books, while they are definitely nonfiction, they read in a narrative form that makes them very consumable for someone like me who doesn't like dry material. So I would love to see more people picking up nonfiction. It's something I don't get to talk about enough on this channel because I am more focused on novels and other forms of fiction, but I think this one is great. I want to reread it, so maybe I'll do that actually after recording this video. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out now that you finish the Three-Body Problem and its sequels? And have you watched the Netflix TV show? I'm recording this before it's out actually, so I will be hopefully binging through this as you're watching this. So if you're new to my channel and do want to stick around, I hope you do. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. Don't forget, I've done a dedicated spoiler-free review on the Remembrance Earth trilogy. I'll have that linked down below and in the cards. If you want to help me out with this video, I appreciate that quite a bit. If you want to give it a thumbs up, drop a comment, even just a little emoji like a planet or a spaceship, it lets me know you're here and it lets YouTube know that you're enjoying it as well. If you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.